You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Not everything is morally neutral. In fact, a lot of things aren't. And I would say that we could all look to the Jewish people and the Palestinian people and say, yes, it's not fair that they end up as individual people in the front lines or in the crosshairs of these conflicts. But if you are stacking up Israel and Hamas, 100% full stop, Israel's the good guy, Hamas is the bad guy. There is zero justification for any other position. And it doesn't have to be a 100% full-throated defense of every single domestic decision made by the Israeli government, but it's talking about rule of law versus law of the jungle, respect for life versus destruction of life. And this is something that, again, Canadian politicians would be well-suited to realize that not everything has to become this morally neutral pablum, which is what Marc Garneau's statement about this, which came out yesterday, was. He said Canada was gravely concerned by the situation, urges all parties to take immediate steps to end the violence. He says, yes, the indiscriminate barrage of rocket attacks fired by Hamas is unacceptable and must cease. But then he goes on and says, but Canada is gravely concerned by the continued expansion of settlements and by the demolitions and evictions, including the ongoing cases in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan. He says these actions impact families and livelihoods and do not serve peace or international law, even though it's a case going before the Supreme Court that is just a real estate dispute. But Marc Garneau didn't get into that. And then he said Canada wants a two-state solution with Palestinians living side by side with an Israel state, and Canada reiterates its call for immediate de-escalation. Now, Candace Malcolm, my colleague, made a brilliant point on this. She said, the statement is equivocal nonsense. It's like they took a conservative news release condemning Hamas terrorism, then found an NDP news release demonizing Israel and stapled them together. And I still chuckle when I see that because I think she captures it well, whereas they didn't want to actually take a position, so they figured, all right, let's criticize both sides and maybe everyone will love us. And if you look at the response to Marc Garneau's tweet, all of the Israel lovers are saying, well, this is terrible. And all the Palestinian lovers are saying, well, this is all terrible. So they did that whole thing of trying to walk the line and keep both sides happy and ending up alienating both, which is why you need to stand up for truth. Canada should never shy away from being an ally of Israel. And I lament that we have lost that strong bond that we had under Stephen Harper, who put out a fantastic statement on this. Clear and concise. Horrific scenes out of Israel over the last 24 hours as civilians shelter from a barrage of terrorist escalation. Attacks on the state of Israel are attacks on us all and must be immediately condemned by international leaders. I pray for the safety of everyone in the region. There's respect for life, but a clear and unequivocal stand that Israel is the one being attacked. Israel is not the aggressor. And when people point to the sophistication of Israeli weaponry, Israel is better at this. But that does not make them the bad guys, and Mike Fagelman pointed this out quite clearly. Israel goes through painstaking efforts to minimize Palestinian casualties. Yet Hamas goes to every effort possible to maximize casualties on both sides of the Gaza wall, their own people and those of Israel. So when you get people like NDP leader Jagmeet Singh calling for a halt on Canadian arms sales to Israel as violence escalates, what the NDP is saying is that Israel does not have the right to defend itself. He says by arming one side of the conflict, it is undermining the peace process and it is supporting illegal occupation. Illegal occupation of whom? Gaza is not occupied. There are no settlements in Gaza. Israel unilaterally left Gaza and said, fine, we will take the first step. And what has Gaza done? It has replaced a government that it had that was not particularly great with one that's even worse, which continues to seek the complete destruction of the Jewish state, the complete elimination of the Jewish people, and they're the ones who are somehow painted in Canadian media and by the leader of the NDP as being the victims. And interestingly enough, I mentioned to Mike a few moments ago how fraught a lot of discourse about Israel is. Things that you're not allowed to say, things that are very loaded terms and ways in which you could accidentally do it. One of them, which is very deliberate, is where you recognize Israel's capital as being. Now, the reality is, functionally, Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. Israel has had control of West Jerusalem since Israel existed for the first time, and Israel has had control of East Jerusalem since the end of the Six-Day War. But functionally speaking, Jerusalem is Israel's capital. Historically speaking, Jerusalem is Israel's capital. Yet countries around the world are terrified of realizing that. Just 3 countries of, I believe, the 90 countries that have embassies in Israel have them in Jerusalem. The most notable of those is the United States, which moved its there in 2018 at the behest of Donald Trump. Aaron O'Toole has said that Canada's Conservatives, if they form government, will move Canada's embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. But interestingly enough, I stumbled on a pretty significant story that Global Affairs Canada staff actually prepared for a move of Canada's embassy to Jerusalem, a tremendously important step, although it never actually happened, the reason being there was no buy-in from Justin Trudeau's Liberals. But how I found this is I reached out to Global Affairs with what's called an access to information request, so trying to get a hold of internal government documents. I did it in 2019, and I've only just gotten a non-response now. But I actually did it after former Conservative leader Andrew Scheer had pledged, if he was elected, that he would move the embassy to Jerusalem. And I said, well, I wonder what Global Affairs staff are saying about this. So I put in the request for May 2019, when Scheer made the pledge, to December, when I put in the access to information request. So pretty much a 7-month period or so, or 6.5-month period. I just last week got a response that said the following: I have looked through the documents received from our respective program area, and although the department did in fact prepare for a possible move of the Canadian embassy to Jerusalem, the move did not happen. Since the relocation of the embassy did not happen, many of the documents contain information for the preparation of the move, and therefore all contain references to cabinet. Cabinet documents are confidential. They are not subject to access to information laws, which means that any document that was destined for cabinet, the government doesn't have to disclose. But the non-response of these documents, the non-production of them, tells me that there was a very serious, although it's not clear how serious, push towards moving the embassy, or at the very least something that would have been given to a cabinet member for sign-off, but it did not happen. Now, on background, a Global Affairs Canada source told me there was no formal memorandum to cabinet, which would have been a document that the foreign minister at the time would have brought to his colleagues. That didn't happen. So we know that Justin Trudeau's position on this has not changed, which is absolutely not, as Global Affairs told me, Canada will not be moving its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and the long-standing position is that the status of Jerusalem can only be resolved as part of a general settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. So again, not taking a clear position, but it's not like the equivocation is dismantling any of the conflict. It's not like the equivocation is contributing towards de-escalation. It just means that there's no moral grounding in Canada's position on this at this time. If you liked watching this clip of The Andrew Lawton Show, True North has lots more for you all over at www.tnc.news.